my name is Antero Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at Stanford University. Uh, I mainly dig into what do we mean by literacies in relation to kind of the digital, but I'm much more interested in what we mean by the analog, which means reflecting on the digital. I spend a lot of time thinking about games and civics and what it means in terms of preparing teachers and what it means in terms of preparing youth voice in a wildly changing US society. I'm going to be a bit contrarian here, and I tend to define digital in contrast to analog, right? So if analog are the things that are tactile, are felt, are experienced, are in the moment, and knowing that we can have analog experiences even in digital environments, the digital to me is an approximation of the analog world in which we walk and breathe and feel and sense make. Uh, an example is I might send someone a message through Twitter, or I might create a multimodal video. We're watching this video right now, you're watching me talk. But if you zoom in close enough on my face, it'll be pixelated because it's never the exact same representation as what we have in the quote unquote real or the physical world. So the digital is an approximation of the analog. And as a result, we can think about who approximates it and through which kinds of tools, right? As we look at this through Zoom, or this conversation is being recorded on Zoom, we can think about the histories of what led to telecommunication, recent issues of Zoom's code being, with an exploit being found so that people could potentially spy on other people's laptop computers. And we can just think about the kinds of affordances that are made in these non-neutral systems that are a part of a digital ecosystem or a digital platform. Going back to my basic definition of digital as uh, the as different from or the opposite of analog, we can think about the words. We can think about the etymology within digital as tied to digits, right? That it's the difference between a 0 and a 1 is how we count in digital, right? So a very simple utility of the digital is there's discrete values that we can find between it, right? If you think about an MP3, it has a bit rate, right, which talks about how many bits are represented within a particular amount of time. Those are things we can count. And the useful thing about digital tools is oftentimes the things we can count are archived somewhere in some place. So that's one kind of affordance, is a kind of quantitative outlay on interactions that are maybe easier to parse than in the analog world. The other bigger affordance that I think is much more meaningful, though, is the kind of distributed nature of digital tools, right? The fact that I'm able to have this conversation right now with someone multiple time zones away from me with very little lag in between our interactions really speaks to one of the key opportunities, right? Likewise, the ways that I'm able to see and experience in limited fashion other places is something that the digital extends our human capacities. I think this is what we can think about with technology, is it allows us to be more than human and be in more places and experience more than what we've ever been able to experience. So I think those are some of the pieces. There's a other side to this, though, right? That if I can talk to and hear and see in lots of other places, some of the methodological affordances are also ones where we need to think about what are the perils of getting used to the illusory potential of digital tools. So we need to think about issues of surveillance. We need to think about issues of privacy. We need to think about when we amplify certain people's voices, what kinds of effects does that have on hegemonic values within the United States, right? So our president's tweets are an example of what amplification in digital systems can be very worrisome, at the same time that we can herald these same tools for allowing young people's voices to be democratized and allowing everybody to have an opportunity to be heard, right? So when we think about all of the kinds of methodological possibilities, we also need to recognize that things that are good for one person or for one group of scholars oftentimes can cause lots of pain and problems and literal violence towards other folks too. So I think that's probably the tension that we should be thinking about. the good thing for entrepreneurs in the digital landscape is they've for many years now been able to make a lot of money off the backs of teachers and public educational institutes. And we largely get a lot of non-teachers and non-experts about the relationships between young people and adults in classrooms to make and sell stuff to the teaching profession, right? I think that is one thing for us to think about, that if the digital is a new kind of landscape, there are a lot of people who are out there willing to hawk goods in the digital world. These can be things like Scholastic creating Accelerated Reader, which is largely ubiquitous in US English language arts classrooms, or Newsella, right, which translates particular kinds of text to make them meaningful or accessible in quotation marks, to young people, to Edmodo, which is, it's a couple of freeway stops. So I drive past it all the time. It's weird being in the Silicon Valley having this conversation. But Edmodo, which essentially is Facebook, but for educators, right? And all of these have money tied to them, right? So one way that the digital is intersected is through very traditional capitalist means, right? And this is nothing new. We've seen this, for centuries, right? This is the textbook industry. The textbook industry is a participant in this, right? But this is the textbook industry. This is the testing companies, the ZTS. This is charter schools, right? All of these are a part of and contribute to movements of the digital. The other, so that is starting with the cynical side of this, right? That it's all about money all of the time. The other side of this, though, is I don't think that the digital is intersected as meaningfully and as necessarily as it needs to, right? So if we look at the lives of young people today, and we have frameworks like the connected learning framework, we have the deeper learning stuff, right? Like there's lots of people who want to explain that kids are on digital devices all the time, right? And if we think about all of these different kinds of digital contexts today, the real kinds of interests of young people aren't reflected in how schools function, right? School hasn't changed very much since the pre-industrial era, right? We're still governed by bells. We're still sitting in these desks, right? The school still looks the same, even though kids are fundamentally doing different kinds of things. And so if we think about that, then the ways that digital tools have intersected don't reflect the young people's lived realities, right? They don't reflect how kids are using mobile devices. Instead, we punish young people because we don't understand this kind of complex ecosystem of the attention economy, if that's a thing we want to think about, with what it looks like in classrooms. I've tried to do a little bit of this in my work, and I've largely failed, right? Like I've found that my own values oftentimes adhere to what I think schooling is supposed to be, and that means oftentimes I've pushed against young people, and so I've been a little critical of myself and my work, trying to think about those tensions. But I think this does feel like if we're talking to educators and people who are concerned about the well-being of young people, we need to think about, rather than trying to control their bodies and their lives and their interests in online selves, how do we bring those parts of who young people are and center that in how we structure schooling experiences? I think that's probably the challenge we need to think about as we shift in digital contexts. I'll end this question where I start, as a reminder to myself so I don't forget, by revisiting the analog, because I actually think that is the future of how we think about the digital. But I think right now, particularly if we think about post-2016 presidential election in the United States, the ways that we've understood things like social media, we've thought about things like bots, we've thought about politicized language like fake news. Probably one of the biggest things that's largely been absent in much of digital literacy's research is the fact that none of this is neutral, right? And the fact that almost every interaction that we have in digital context is on a particular platform, right? So talked earlier about Zoom as having particular kinds of values and affordances. Sophia Noble's work in Algorithms of Oppression really breaks down how something like the ubiquity of Google is never neutral, right? And she spends that entire book Googling the phrase Black girls and seeing what the results say, right? And starting with a history of very problematic racist sexualized images, moving towards more neutral and positive affirmations over a decade, right? And you just think about how a system like Google is in the background in ways that are opaque and not seen by the public, constantly shifting their code and changing what we're able to see, right? We think about Twitter and the ways that this system amplifies particular values. Uh, People outside of education have framed this around big words like platform capitalism or surveillance capitalism, right? And I think these are important words, but for the context of digital literacy scholars, we should be thinking about what are the platforms on which we're studying, right? And how do we recognize that none of those are ever neutral, and understand those values from a critical media literacy stance is probably a thing for us to think about. Once we think about that in a digital context, though, that then allows us to think about schools as, oh yeah, schools aren't neutral either, right? Whose land are we on when we're walking into classrooms, right? Um, in a very reflexive way about thinking about the settler colonial histories in the United States, right? As one space to think about this, right? We should be positioning ourselves to think about this. I think this then gets us to um, like as we think about the boundaries of the digital, it's going to blur more and more with the non-digital, right? The fact that we're having this conversation as I sit at a desk and I'm drinking coffee, right? And I'm writing things with a pen. This intersects, right? So the fact that the digital doesn't happen in this bubble outside of the analog is an important thing for us to kind of explore and think about as one side of this. And that then means that as the resolution of the digital world becomes more and more clear, we need to think about like the real lives and experiences that are cultivated in online spaces, right? So if I think about the gaming communities I've worked with, and particularly the kinds of powerful and affirmative and positive experiences for the LGBTQ plus community of tabletop game designers that I've connected with, the digital communities are real communities with a lot of affordances and values that are very meaningful to the participants I've been privileged to get to work with. And so as a result, I want us to think about what are those analog relationships and communicative practices that exist within or in lieu of being a part of a digital ecosystem. I think that is actually the boundary that I would push on, right? What is the analog relationships that are most valuable to experience in digital spaces?